Hi, Bill Lethman here from Lethman Financial. Welcome back to our free video series on annuities. In this video, you'll learn about the third type of annuity called an indexed annuity. It's also called a fixed indexed annuity because it's actually a form of a fixed annuity. Now, the biggest difference of an indexed annuity versus a regular fixed annuity is how you earn interest on your account. With an indexed annuity, your interest is actually going to be based on the participation of an underlying index like the Standard & Poor's 500 or the NASDAQ. Now, we know that over time the market's going to go up and the market's going to go down. The basic premise of an indexed annuity is this. You capture the upside of the market in the good years, but in the years when the market does bad, you just flatline and get a 0% return for the year. So your principal is safe. The following year, if the market goes up again, you have your principal intact and you capture another positive return. However, there's some caveats to how your account earns interest. There's two critical factors that you need to know and understand before investing in one of these indexed annuities. The first are what are your limitations to return, and the second, what is the crediting method used? Let's start with limitations to return. There's three primary ways that insurance companies will limit how much interest you get credited to your account each year. The first way is through a cap or a ceiling, which basically means they limit you as to how much interest you can earn in any given year. Right now, most of these caps are in the 4 to 5% range. So if your cap is 5 and the index goes up by 12%, you get limited by your cap, and you would earn a 5% return for the year. If the index went up by 3%, you would earn 3%, but if the index went down by 11%, you would get 0. Remember, your principal is always protected. The second way is through what's called a spread. The spread is an amount that's subtracted from the return of the index each year. So if the index went up by 12% and you had a spread of 4%, you would earn 8%. And again, if the index is negative, you just get 0% for the year. And the third limit is through what's called a participation rate. This is a percentage of how much you participate in the performance of the underlying index. So if your participation rate was 80% and the index went up by 10%, your return for the year would be 8%, or simply 80% of the 10% return of the index. And again, if the index is negative, you just get 0. So it's very important to know what the limitations to return are. Different companies will use different methods. And believe it or not, some companies will actually use all three. The second critical factor to understanding indexed annuities are the crediting strategies. Now, there's three primary methods insurance companies use to credit interest to your account: annual point-to-point, monthly averaging, and the monthly sum. To illustrate how each of these crediting strategies work, let's look at some hypothetical examples. Let's use the historical data for the S&P 500 index for the calendar year 2010, and we'll look at how each of the three crediting strategies would have given you a different outcome. First, let's start with this. In 2010, the total return for the S&P 500 stock index was up 15.08%, which included the dividends. Something important to note is that when these indexed annuities are calculating the movement of your index, they don't include any dividends. They're really just using the closing prices. In 2010, while the total return including dividends was up 15.08%, if you took the dividend portion out and just looked at the performance based on the price of the index alone, your return would have only been 12.7%, a difference of 2.38%. In some years, those dividends were the difference between the index being positive or negative and whether you would have gotten an interest credit for the year or not at all. Okay, first, let's look at the annual point-to-point method. probably the easiest to calculate. We'll assume that there's a 5% cap to earnings. So let's see how this looks. On January 1st, 2010, the S&P 500 had a starting value of 1,115. And on December 31st, 2010, the S&P 500 closed at a value of 1,257. So we're going to take our beginning value and subtract it from our ending value, which means that our index went up by 142 points. Now we divide this by the starting value. We find that our index went up by 12.7%. But remember, we have a cap of 5%. So our interest credit for the year is 5% because it was limited by the cap. The second method is called monthly averaging. With monthly averaging, it can be common to see a spread used to limit your interest. For this example, we'll use a spread of 4.5%. Now I have up here the end of the month closing prices of the S&P 500 for each of the 12 months in 2010. The first step is to add up all those closing prices from each of the 12 months, which comes out to be 13,562. Then we're going to divide that by 12 to get our average monthly price on a monthly average basis of 1,130. Now we're going to take that figure and subtract the starting value, 1,115, which means that the index went up by 15 points on a monthly average basis. Now we're going to divide this by our starting value to get our percent gain of the index using the monthly averaging method, which is 1.36%. Remember, we still have to subtract our spread of 4.5%. Which means that we actually end up at a negative number for the year. So the interest credit for the year would be 0. You didn't make anything, but you didn't lose anything either. Okay, let's look at the final crediting strategy, monthly sum. With monthly sum, it's common to see a cap. However, this will be a monthly cap. For this example, let's use 2% as our monthly cap. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at this middle column over here, the percent change of our index on a monthly basis. And we're going to apply our cap to that column so we can see what the effect of that cap was on a monthly basis. So in January, our index on a monthly basis was down 3.7%. But in February, our index was up 2.85%, but it's limited by the cap, so that's 2%. In March, our index was up 5.88%, again limited by the cap. April, we were up 1.48. May, 8.2 negative. June, negative 5.39. July, limited by our cap. August, down 4.74. September, limited by our cap. Limited by our cap again in October. And December, limited again by our cap. So if we add up this column, means that we earned on a monthly sum basis minus 8.78%. So you can really see firsthand how the handful of negative months really eats away from the return from the positive months. For example, the negative 8.2% return for the month of May eats up over 4 months of positive returns. The fact there's no limit to the downside but a cap on the upside really makes it difficult to see a positive result for any given year. Of course, your credit can't be less than 0. So here in this example, with this monthly sum crediting method, your return for the year would have been 0. So to recap, the best option in this example was the annual point-to-point, where your account would have earned 5%. But remember, this was a good year. Not every year is going to be like this. So with an index annuity that uses point-to-point, like we used here in this example, and you had a 5% cap, the most you could make in any year would be 5%. That's if the index was up 5% or more every single year. Now, the chances of that happening would be extremely rare. So every year that your interest credit is less than 5% or 0 for the months, for the years when the market is negative, it'll bring down your average compounded rate of return. I think when it really comes down to it, you really need to give this a lot of thought. There may very well be other alternatives that could give you a similar return on your money without having to lock it up in an annuity. At best, this method may over time slightly outperform the returns that you could get from CDs or money markets. Eventually, interest rates are going to go back up. If your money's locked up in an annuity, you may not be able to take advantage of them. Monthly sum and monthly average really only work well when the index is moving in a very consistent and upward direction, unlike the markets we've been experiencing for the last 12 years or so. Eventually we might get there, but I don't think we're there yet. But even in the best bull markets, we still see at least a month or two each year when the markets go down, and this can significantly impact your results. Again, I really don't like the monthly sum because of the caps on the upside and the fact there's no limit on the downside. And even the monthly average method, with the ups and downs we typically see throughout the course of the year, can have some very negative effects on how your interest gets credited. So, just as with all annuities, make sure you get all the facts, ask lots of questions, read the prospectus and other illustrations before you buy. I'll see you in the next video.